This portion of the lecture series has to do with Denali National Park and Preserve, which is a unit of the National Park Service that I had the privilege to work at many years ago. So this will be a personal perspective about Alaska. One of the things I did a lot was to travel all over the state beyond Denali National Park and Preserve, in addition to spending as much time as possible on my weekends going into Denali National Park itself. But one of the places that we went to was to the north, Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. And you may recall from the little book, Moving Beyond Treeline, that this is where the first no rescue wilderness or rescue-free wilderness had been proposed by Dr. Dan Dustin and Dr. Leo McAvoy. Now, one of the things about being this far north in Alaska is that you have what is oftentimes called the land of the midnight sun. And that means that during the summer months, and especially in June, you have the sun setting perhaps around midnight. If you go even further north in Alaska than Denali, if you go even further north, then sometimes the sun doesn't set at all. So, for example, here at Gates of the Arctic, this is the sunset at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and about 15 minutes later, about 2:15 a.m., the sun rose. So again, even further north than that, the sun doesn't set at all for several weeks, which is a remarkable phenomenon in the summer. So this is a land of almost endless tundra. You are above tree line in much of the state, and it seems to go on forever. It's also a land of what would seem to be an almost endless pipeline that takes you all the way from the north shore of Alaska all the way down to the port of Valdez, an 800-mile long pipeline. This is a land of purple mountain majesties. This is overlooking the little fishing village of Homer, Alaska. And when visiting there, we were able to gorge on fresh seafood to include wild halibut, Alaskan salmon, and even king crab. There are along the coastline a number of marine mammal species that you can observe, including sea otters, sea lions, orcas or killer whales, and even gray whales migrating all the way from the north shore of Alaska, the Bering and Chukchi Seas, all the way down the coast to the lagoons of Baja California, where the adult whales mate and the pregnant females give birth. This is also a land of tidewater glaciers and glacial bays. And here you can actually see huge pieces of ice calve off the main glacier and create explosions in the water. So just a remarkable landscape. Now, zeroing in on where I lived, so this is within the housing complex at Denali National Park. I lived in this cabin, and at first I thought that it was pretty cool, but then upon moving in, I realized that there was no running water. And so there was no kitchen sink or bathroom or shower or anything like that that would require running water. There was no running water. So I was a little bit irritated with the federal government for having housing like this for their federal employees, but I kind of got used to it and eventually almost got to appreciate that in at least some way, in some sense, I was living as did the early miners and the early trappers to the state of Alaska. And then that said, of course, there was, not too far away, a shower house where people could shower up and so on, and also wash dishes and that sort of thing. It could snow any time of the year where I was in Alaska. So this was actually a photograph taken in the summertime. And I'd like to point out that one of the aspects of my job was to take care of the sled dogs. Not so much take care of them, but to harness them and run them around a track as a demonstration for visitors to see how the sled dogs are used in the wintertime as working dogs. Of course, they're not working during the summer other than these demonstrations for the public. And so we would harness up 5 of the sled dogs, would choose them, and we would then get behind a sled on wheels and would take this around a track to the enjoyment of the visiting public. In the wintertime, the dogs are used to do wildlife biology surveys, to take supplies out to wildlife biologists in cabins, and to go on patrol and these sorts of things. Overall, the sled dogs are alert, proud, enthusiastic, and strong, with the exception of Abe. And Abe had the distinction of being the oldest dog in the kennel. And Abe, when he was much younger, he actually ran the Iditarod. So that's the 1,100-mile sled dog race from Anchorage to Nome. So Abe at this point was about 12 years old, and his glory years were behind him. Well, you have just this incredible mountain scenery in Denali National Park and Preserve. And there's actually a road that takes you between what's called the Alaska Range and the Outer Range, 2 different mountain ranges. And this road is a dirt road, and there's no intent to have it paved. But you can see here, if you look sort of to the left in the corner, there's, to the bottom corner, looks like a little slice of yellow. That's actually a school bus. And what was being done at that time is that people would load up on school buses, and then the school buses would take them out into the park. What that meant is that you had far less crowding with everyone in their own vehicle, or, each couple or family in its own vehicle. So that was not only better in terms of keeping congestion down on the road itself, but also better for wildlife that would be less likely to be spooked by everyone sort of in one bus as compared to all of these cars. So the little streak up and to the right is a little bit of a rainbow. It's hard to see in the photograph, but I always like to think of this symbolically as the bus being at the end of the rainbow, something that worked very well, not only for people to better enjoy the park, but for the wildlife in which, of course, the park is their home. So one of the things that I did as well as a ranger there was to provide to the public what were called discovery hikes. So all of us who were in the naturalist division and did interpretive hikes just loved this assignment. And you basically go out, and there are, in effect, no trails in Denali National Park and Preserve. Except for a couple nature trails right at the entrance of the park by the visitor center, there are no trails. So we would take people out and explore. So again, these were called discovery hikes. And if you look very closely, counting people from the right, so there's a person in sort of a white jacket with a blue backpack on in the far right, and then someone in a blue jacket and a blue backpack, it looks like. Well, right next to that person, so the third person in, that's actually me, telling people about the tundra ecology in Denali National Park. So I don't remember who took this photograph or how I ever got it, but and you can't see very clearly, but it's at a time when I had longer hair and a full beard and didn't wear glasses. So this was a while ago. So here I am explaining to these good visitors a little bit more about the ecology of the area. And we would hike sometimes all day. So these were pretty cool things to be involved with. Discovery hikes might be as short as 2 to 4 hours or as long as an all-day excursion. And so we'd have glacial rivers that would cross, little tributaries to the glacial rivers in this case. And incidentally, this person didn't make it, as I recall. So Uh, in addition to the discovery hikes and working with the sled dogs, well, one of the things I really enjoyed was going out backpacking on my own, solo trips. So here you can see my old Kelty backpack and my ice pick, and then in the foreground, what's called a bear-resistant food container. And the way this works is that you put all your food into this container, and brown bears can't get in. So the idea is to keep the bears from associating people with food. And this is something they actually tried this out at the San Francisco Zoo with brown bears there, grizzly bears, and found that in fact the bears couldn't open these things. It's a very high grade plastic. And this concept, incidentally, has now been adopted in most national parks where there are bears. Well, some wildlife biologists had told me about Dall sheep that had just recently given birth to lambs. And so I went up a canyon called Savage Canyon to find these sheep, Dall sheep, D-A-L-L, after a famous naturalist. Well, I found the Dall sheep, and each of them you can see has a little lamb right next to it. You see their little ears poking out. And then once the sheep got up, the lambs were still so young that they were still nursing. So they got right up and underneath their mothers, and they were nursing. So you have at Denali National Park a lake that sits pretty much toward the base of Denali itself, the mountain, what used to be called Mount McKinley. Denali, the mountain, is the highest mountain on the North American continent at just over 20,000 feet. And so on this particular evening, of course, it was around midnight, just starting to get dark, again, land of the midnight sun. Anyway, I started taking photographs. I had my tripod. I started taking photographs of the changing cloud formations as the night progressed. And I don't even know how many of these photographs I've got of the changing cloud conditions, but it's quite a gallery of photos, I can tell you that much. But even more spectacular than seeing the clouds that were reflected in Wonder Lake was to see Denali reflected in Wonder Lake. And so here you can see an almost full moon in the left-hand corner of the slide, and then the pink alpenglow just starting to rise up toward the top of the mountain, a phenomenon that occurs as the sun sets. And you can see the cloud cover is lifting from the top of the mountain, and ultimately, just about 15 minutes later, it looked like this. And incidentally, I actually have this photograph that I blew up to 16 by 20. In other words, it's pretty big, and it's framed, and it hangs in my bedroom. So I have cherished memories of working at Denali National Park and Preserve. The mountain itself is an attraction to climbers all over the world, again at just over 20,000 feet. But the park itself was not designated as a result of this highest mountain on the continent, but rather for the wildlife. And here you can see a brown bear, a mother bear, who is showing her two cubs how to dig for Arctic ground squirrels. And so I was observing all of this, and she gathered the cubs around for the lesson and started digging into the tundra. Note the keen observation skills of the cubs as the mother bear shows them how to catch a ground squirrel. Well, as it turns out, the mother bear did not eventually capture a ground squirrel and walked away, but one of the cubs went over to try and dig out the ground squirrel, and it too was unsuccessful and ultimately walked away dejected. So our Alaska wildlands in general are a place where we can go to see the last frontier, to see a place that still remains unspoiled in just about any way. Incidentally, this is another photograph that I blew up to 16 by 20, and it also hangs in my home. So by setting aside these lands, it's not only an opportunity for us, but it allows the wildlife that is dependent on this habitat to continue to thrive. And then these landscapes are not only important to us, but as Theodore Roosevelt said, for our children and for our children's children. And in that regard, also for future generations of wildlife. So in conclusion then, I suggest the following. Let's save these amazing places for our children and our children's children. For the human culture that has lived there for so long. For the wildlife, species other than our own, who depend on the habitat to survive. Because of its extraordinary beauty and wildness, because there is no place like it on Earth, because once it's destroyed, it's gone.